Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jodi Dean, who is coming to us today from Hobart William and Smith Colleges, from Geneva, New York, which is at the tip of the Finger Lakes districts. For those of you who don't know, it would be around the corner if there wouldn't be Lake Ontario in the middle. The reason why I mentioned that it's a pleasure to have her here is because she was very generous in allowing us to invite her during what I would refer to as her, world communism tour that is taking her. She was just in Croatia 2 weeks ago. She's going to Denmark next week, and then so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that given all of the work and the publications that she's done, it's for me who works with Jodi a lot, and we co-edit a journal called Theory and Event. It's a fabulous thing that she's a very strong internet personality, a self-loathing blogger, and always present on the internet because we wouldn't get any work done given her travel schedule. So it's very nice to be able to welcome her here. Hopefully she won't have too stressful of a time. At least there's no jet lag to deal with. Now Jodi graduated, finished her PhD in the political science program at Columbia University, and since then has been publishing regularly on a series of compelling and really sort of exciting things. She is one of the people, I would say, that coming from the discipline of political theory myself and arriving in cultural studies, she's one of the people that made cultural studies as a discipline relevant to political theory, and that's just one of her many contributions. One of the contributions that I find still most, well, it gives me the giggles, despite the fact that it's a good contribution, is her book on alien subcultures in America as a critique of Habermasian public spheres. She has several other books that have developed from that, Publicity Secret. How recent is Zizek's Politics? Not too recent. 2006. Yeah, so it's, she's had a, 2006, she wrote Zizek's Politics, and subsequently Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies. Most recently, in the book that we've been discussing in the graduate program, both, today in the PhD program in Cultural Studies and tomorrow in the MA and TCP, is her book called Blog Theory. And then finally today, she will be talking to us about her most recent book that is physically available but not commercially available, which is The Communist Horizon. It's part of the Verso series, the little red book series that Verso has been doing. It's kind of really exciting. A couple of other things. She's not just a prolific academic writer, but Jodi, for those of you who don't know, has a very active blog personality at iSite. That's the name of the blog, but it's jodideansite.blog or whatever. Yeah, whatever it is. So for those of you who read blogs on a regular basis, I highly recommend it simply because there's a lot of really exciting and very active political things that she posts on regularly and comments on regularly. Finally, one of the reasons why Jodi has been traveling a lot as well is because she's one of the sort of most vocal and most present theorists of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And this is why I told her, I asked permission because I wanted to introduce her today as our generation's Emma Goldman. Simply because she has taken the movement and the ideas and engaged directly with people at the whole Occupy Wall Street in New York, but also throughout the world. This is one of the reasons why she was in Croatia and has been following and charting and participating in the Occupy movements throughout the world. So she's one of those rare sort of political thinkers and cultural thinkers who is actually also doing grassroots politics. For these and many other reasons, it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend, my colleague, and our speaker for this evening, Jodi Dean.
The term horizon marks a division. Understood spatially, the horizon is the line dividing the visible, separating earth from sky. Understood temporally, the horizon converges with loss in a metaphor for privation and depletion. The lost horizon suggests abandoned projects, prior hopes that have now passed away. Astrophysics offers a thrilling, even uncanny horizon, the event horizon surrounding a black hole. The event horizon is the boundary beyond which events cannot escape. Although event horizon denotes the curvature in space-time affected by a singularity, it's actually not that much different from the spatial horizon. Both evoke a fundamental division that we experience as impossible to reach and that we can neither escape nor cross. I use horizon not to recall a forgotten future, but to designate a dimension of experience that we can never lose. Even if, lost in a fog or focused on our feet, we fail to see it. The horizon is real in the sense of impossible, we can never reach it, and in the sense of actual, it shapes our setting. So we can lose our bearings, but the horizon is a necessary dimension of our actuality. Whether the effect of a singularity or the meeting of earth and sky, the horizon is the fundamental division establishing where we are. With respect to politics, the horizon that conditions our experience is communism. I get the term communist horizon from Bruno Bastilles, who gets it from Alvaro Garcia Linera, vice president of Bolivia. Garcia Linera was the running mate of Evo Morales on the ticket Movement to Socialism, Political Instrument for the Sovereignty of the Peoples. He's the author of multiple pieces on Marxism, politics, and sociology, at least one of which was written while he served time in prison for armed uprising. Bastilles quotes Garcia Linera's response to an interviewer's questions about his party's plans following their electoral victory. The general horizon of the era is communist. Garcia Linera doesn't explain the term. He evokes the communist horizon as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Assuming it as an irreducible feature of our political setting, he says, we enter the movement with our expecting and desiring eyes set on the communist horizon. Now, some on the US left think that the communist horizon is a lost horizon. This is a mistake that capitalists, conservatives, and even liberal Democrats don't make, insofar as they see the threat of communism everywhere 20 years after its ostensible demise. To think further about how this communist horizon manifests itself to us today, how we feel its force, how it formats our setting, I treat communism as a tag for 6 features of our conjuncture. And you saw the list just a minute ago. A specific state, so here's the 6 features if you're like trying to take notes or follow. First is a specific state formation that collapsed in 1991. Second, a present force. Third, the sovereignty of the people. 4, the force of the common and the commons. 5, the collective desire for collectivity. And 6, the actuality of revolution. My goal in describing our current conjuncture in terms of these 6 features is to highlight how the actuality of communism is actually an ideal for us, one worth fighting for in a struggle that is ever more urgent and necessary. As Bastilles argues, invoking the communist horizon produces a complete shift in perspective or a radical ideological turnabout such that capitalism no longer appears as the only game in town. With communism as our horizon, the field of possibilities for revolutionary theory and practice starts to change shape. Barriers to action fall away. New potentials and challenges come to the fore. Anything is possible. We can set our expecting and desiring eyes here and now on a different organization of social relationships. And that's a quote from Bastilles. Instead of a politics thought primarily in terms of resistance, playful and momentary aesthetic disruptions, the immediate specificity of local projects, and struggles for hegemony within a capitalist parliamentary setting, the communist horizon impresses on us the necessity of the abolition of capitalism and the creation of global practices and institutions of egalitarian cooperation. The shift in perspective the communist horizon produces turns us away from the democratic milieu that has been the form of the loss of communism as a name for left aspiration, and toward the reconfiguration of the components of political struggle. In other words, away from general inclusion, momentary calls for broader for broad awareness and lifestyle changes, and toward militant opposition, tight organizational forms like the party, the council, the working group, or the cell, and the sovereignty of the people over the economy through which we produce and reproduce ourselves. In short, the communist horizon orients our politics such that we're fighting not just against, but for. And I think this may be why some on the left have been reluctant to embrace communism. It fearlessly advocates the collective power of the people. So I'm now going to talk about the first tag, communism is a name for the USSR or the Soviet system. Now, for most people in the US, communism refers to the Soviet Union. But this complicates matters insofar as the Soviet Union did not claim to have achieved communism, although its ruling party called itself a communist party. As in the case with any party or political system, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union changed over time, moving from a revolutionary party to a governing bureaucratic party that also experienced changes over time, changes that were sometimes violent, sometimes incremental. Insofar as it was a political party, and for most of its history, the only recognized political party, the Communist Party in the former Soviet Union was a locus of struggle and disagreement over a host of issues from art, literature, and science to economic development, foreign policy, and internal relations among the various republics. So basically, the kind of payoff of this line of argument is to say that the Soviet Union is not a stable referent of communism. Now, it tends to be stabilized via the proper name of Stalin, where Stalinist tags practices of monopolizing and consolidating power in the state party bureaucracy. Communism as Stalinism is marked by authoritarianism, prison camps, and the inadmissibility of criticism. Generally, it eclipses post-Stalinist developments in the Soviet Union, particularly with regard to successes in modernizing and improving overall standards of living. Treatments of communism as Stalinism usually present themselves as concrete historical analysis. Most of the time, they are nothing of the sort. Rather, they are appeals to history made in an attempt to repress the communist alternative. Consider first where the facts of this history come from. Michael E. Brown and Randy Martin argue persuasively that there's not yet a credible and established body of historical literature on communism, socialism, or the Soviet Union. Most of the histories we have were produced in the context of a hegemonic anti-communism. The methodological and conceptual defects in scholarly studies of the Soviet Union would be scandalous in other academic fields. Second, the history invoked to repress the communist alternative is bizarrely deterministic, with no room for chance and contingency. If Lenin, then Stalin. If party, then Gulag. If it happened once, it will happen again, and there's nothing we can do about it. The oddity of this position is that communism is unique in its determining capacity, the one political arrangement capable of eliminating contingency and directing action along a singular vector. Communism becomes the exception to the dynamic of production, struggle, and experience that gives rise to it. Instead of the politics of a militant subject, communism appears in this version as a linear process with a certain end. Thus, third, history itself starts to function as a constant incapable of change and impenetrable by external forces. Any particular moment is a container for this essential whole: the Leninist Party, the Stalinist show trials, the KGB, the Brezhnev-era stagnation. Each of these becomes interchangeable with the other as an example of the error of communism, precisely because communism is invariant. In contrast with capitalism's permanent revolution, historical communism, in this version that I'm sketching here, historical communism appears as impossibly static. Only by supposing this constant, unchanging communism can the appeal to history turn a single instance into a damning example of the failed and dangerous communist experience. And as it does, it disconnects communism from the very history to which it appeals, erasing not only communism as capitalism's self-critique, but also the Soviet Union as the United States mirror, ally, enemy, and other. This is the inner truth of the liberal, democratic, capitalist, and conservative appeal to history, not to inspire inquiry, but to preserve the fantasy that capitalism and democracy are the best possible economic and political arrangements. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about communism as a present force. If the end of the Soviet Union were the same as the end of communism, then communism would be past, right? Like the Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire. As a particular political formation, it would be an artifact to be analyzed and studied. Whatever gave it breath, whatever made it real, would be gone. Yet communism persists. It's frequently evoked as a living presence or possibility. In the US, communism is used as a term of opprobrium so frequently that one would think the Cold War never ended. What's communist? National health care, environmentalism, feminism, public education, progressive taxation, paid vacation days, gun control. Bicycles are a gateway drug to communism. Web 2.0 is communist because it holds out the seductive promise of individual self-realization that Karl Marx evoked in the German ideology. And who's communist? Anyone who protested US military aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan, anyone critical of the Bush administration, Democratic political leaders like Nancy Pelosi, and of course, Barack Obama. Now, it's obvious enough that contemporary Democrats are not communists. The Democratic Party did not even attempt to pass a single-payer health insurance program, and its response to the economic crisis has focused on the finance sector. The constant evocations of an encroaching communist threat in the US could thus seem to be a not very creative return to the language of the Cold War and Red Scare, a conservative retreat to a formerly effective rhetoric of fear. But it's not. It's actually an indication of a concrete awareness of the need for, the demand for, an alternative to capitalism. Now, in the US, we're reminded daily that radical change is possible, and we're incited to fear it. The threat or specter is communism, right-wing radio and blogs scream, and if we don't do something, they tell us, we will all be under the communist yoke. The right, even the center, regularly invokes the possibility of radical change, and it names that change communism. Why does it name the change communism? Because extreme inequality is visible and undeniable. The US has generally positioned extreme inequality, indebtedness, and decay elsewhere, offshore. The economic recession, collapse in the housing and mortgage markets, increase in permanent involuntary unemployment, and trillion-dollar bank bailouts, however, have made what we were told was the third world into our world. The division cutting across capitalist societies is more visible, more palpable in the US now than it's been since at least the 1930s. More of our children live in poverty than at any time in US history. The wealth of the very, very rich, the top 1%, has dramatically increased, while income for the rest of us has remained stagnant or declined. Corporations sit on piles of cash instead of hiring back their laid-off workers. Many of the foreclosures the banks force on homeowners are meaningless, illegal acts of expropriation, right? Because the banks can't document who owns what. They lack all of the documentation that they need to justify the foreclosure proceedings that they've been undertaking. And of course, poverty in the US is at the highest it's been since the early 60s. We know the 1% aren't job creators. They are wealth expropriators, fearful of the rising anger and power of the collective people. Now, in a culture where the mantra for over 50 years has been what's good for business is good for America, I'm sorry, my hair's getting in my mouth, and where since the presidency of Ronald Reagan, we've been urged to believe that inequality is good because what benefits the rich trickles down to the rest of us. I wondered what that trickling was. It didn't seem like benefits, but the current undeniability of division matters. Inequality is appearing as a factor, a force, and a crime. The J.P. Morgan and LIBOR scandals are only the most recent. So it's no wonder that we're hearing the name communism again. The antagonism cutting across capitalist societies is visible, palpable, and pressing. The right, even the center, evokes communism as a threat, something to warn against, a terrible past that we should all hasten to avoid. But if it was so terrible, And if it failed, and if it's in the past, then why is it still a threat? The answer is because communism names the alternative to capitalism, the answer to our current economic crisis. So I've considered the right's relation to the communist threat. What about the democratic left? Whereas the right treats communism as a present force, the left is bent around the force of loss, that is, the contorted shape it has found itself in as it has betrayed the communist ideal. The predominant characteristic of the contemporary left has been its frequent claim not to exist. Whereas the right sees left-wing threats everywhere, those on the left eschew any use of the term we, emphasizing instead their own fragmentation into a multitude of singularities. There are events, moments, projects, demonstrations, blogs, sometimes even affinity groups and general assemblies, but the left as such doesn't exist. Not surprisingly then, in these leftist discussions, there is no left political vision or program, a point that is lamented even as it's generally disconnected from the setting in which it appears, namely the loss of a left that says we and our and us in the first place. And I think one of the most profound achievements of Occupy Wall Street has been its establishment of a new sense of collectivity so that we can say we again without any kind of qualification. The rejection of communism as an ideal has shaped the left. Fragmented tributaries and currents, branches and networks of particular projects and partial objects are the left form of the loss of communism. Now, some people think of this form as an advance. They name it democracy, envisioning struggles on the left specifically as struggles for democracy. In some times and places, this could make sense, like the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, in struggles against colonialism and imperialism, even in opposition to the authoritarianism of the party-state bureaucracies of the former East. In these instances, to stand for democracy was to stand against an order constituted against democracy. But in parliamentary democracies, for leftists to refer to their goals as a struggle for democracy is strange. It's not like they're fighting for rights to vote or rights to free speech. Democracy is our ambient milieu, the hegemonic form of contemporary politics. For the left to use the language of democracy now is a way of avoiding the fundamental antagonism between the top 1% and the rest of us by acting as if the only thing missing was participation. Political repercussions of the loss of communism as a name for left aspirations include a corresponding turn away from militant opposition and toward generalized inclusion, as well as an abandonment of the tight organizational forms I mentioned earlier, like the council and the cell, and a turn that's in favor of these thin and momentary calls to become aware of an issue and change one's lifestyle. More fundamentally, the repercussion of the sublimation of communism in democratic preoccupations with process and participation is acquiescence to capitalism as the best system for the production and distribution of resources, labor, and goods. So the mistake leftists make when they turn into liberals and Democrats is thinking that we are beyond the communist horizon. It's thinking that democracy replaced communism rather than acknowledging that democracy serves as the contemporary form of communism's displacement. They can't acknowledge their own complicity with capitalism. If political struggle is always an irreducible dimension of capitalism, and if capitalism is always interlinked with conflict, resistance, accommodation, and demands, then refusals to engage these struggles, rejection of the terms of these struggles will affect the form that capitalism takes. Okay, so I've been talking then about two ways of thinking about the communist horizon, right? So a little recap, just make sure we're all together here, right? I've talked about the past Soviet experiment and the present force. I've described the present force of communism via a right-left distinction between threat and loss, a distinction which rests on a common supposition of democracy. In each instance, communism names that in opposition to which our current setting is configured, the setting in which contemporary capitalism unfolds. Why is communism that name? because it designates the sovereignty of the people, the rule of the people, and not the people as a whole or a unity, but the people as the rest of us, those of us whose work, lives, and futures are expropriated, monetized, and speculated on for the financial enjoyment of the few. The Hungarian Marxist George Lukács invokes the people in just this sense when he explains the dialectical transformation of the concept of the people in Lenin's characterization of the Russian Revolution. There's a quote from Lukács: "The vague and abstract concept of the people had to be rejected, but only so that a revolutionary, discriminating concept of the people, the revolutionary alliance of the oppressed, could develop from a concrete understanding of the conditions of proletarian revolution. The people are the communist political subject." So my claim then is that it makes sense to substitute the idea of the sovereignty of the people for that of the dictatorship of the proletariat. When the people are the subject of communism, their sovereignty is not that of the dispersed individuals of liberal democracy. Rather, the sovereignty of the people designates the direct and fearsome rule of the collective people over those who would oppress and exploit them, over those who would take for themselves what belongs to all in common. As Lenin describes it in State and Revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat is an organization of the oppressed for the purpose of suppressing the oppressor. More than a mere expansion of democracy, more than the inclusion of more people within democracy's purview, the dictatorship of the proletariat puts into practice the purpose and end of democracy, making it serve the many and not the money bags. Consequently and necessarily, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes restrictions. It restricts the freedom of capitalists, exploiters, and oppressors. They're not free to do as they will, but are governed, controlled, and limited by the rest of us. In time, this governance, control, and limitation effectively eliminate the capitalist class. But until the inequality that enables capitalism has been eliminated, the organized power of a state serves as the instrument through which the people not only govern, but through which they ensure that governance is carried out for the benefit of the collective rather than the few. So my wager is that an emphasis on the people as the rest of us can do the work formerly done by proletariat. Qualified as the rest of us, the people designates those proletarianized by capitalism. That is, the people produced through the exploitation, extraction, and expropriation of our practical and communicative activities for the enjoyment of the very, very rich. When communism is our horizon of political possibility, the sovereignty of the people points to a view of the state as what we use to govern for us as a collectivity. It is our collective steering of our common future for our common good. This is what the slogan, "Power to the People," means. Two more points then about this idea of the sovereignty of the people that I'm trying to suggest here. First, the people of communism are not the same as the totality of the people imagined by populism, and the difference is division. Rather than there being a smooth flow from actual people to the collective power of the sovereign people, a gap disrupts the whole, belying the fantasy of a whole unitary people. No matter how popular the sovereign, the people and the government are not present at the same time. Insofar as the people can never be fully present, right? Some don't show up, they didn't hear what was going on, they were misled by a powerful speaker, they were miscounted from the outset, they completely disagreed and so wanted to count themselves out, they were barred from attending. Those are the kind of the ways that's a sort of a list from democratic theory ways of people recognizing the kind of problems of thinking about the people and how they end up not ever being full. So insofar as the people can never be fully present, their necessary absence is the gap of politics. Split, divided, impossible, the people cannot be politically. They're only political through and as one, few, or some. The rule of a leader, party, or constitution compensates for or occupies the whole of the missing conjunction between people and government. Nonetheless, this rule cannot overcome the division that the sovereignty of the people mobilizes. Division goes all the way down. Antagonism is fundamental, it's irreducible. Second, because the people are divided, sovereignty provides a better name for their rule than dictatorship. Now, historically, dictatorship was a temporary arrangement. Whether as a provision in the Roman constitution or a step toward the withering away of the state, dictatorship marks the exceptional convergence of legality and illegality, force and right. Its limited temporality allows for acts justified by revolutionary force alone. As exceptions, they contribute to excessive violence. It's better, I think, for the violence of rule to remain wrong and in need of justification. What were the alternatives? Did it serve the common good? And even if it did, can its justification be generally willed? The revolutionary fury of the people is without limit or control, but this cannot and should not be incorporated into a governing form. Doing so invites excessive measures in the name of revolutionary change, as if transforming the people were a process that could end. Only in a world without people would there be no need for the rule of the people. This rule should be thought in terms of self-governance, self-control, self-steering. Then it can and must be combined and thought with the transsubjective, mutually determining condition of selves, such that there is no self-governance absent collective self-governing. Absent the collective determination of the people over their conditions, each remains unfree. Insofar as communism names this sovereignty, communist movement strives to bring the conditions for it into being, grasping that these conditions are material and that the political sovereignty of the people is impossible when the basic conditions of our lives are outside our collective determination. So to reiterate, the sovereignty I'm describing is unavoidably partial and incomplete. Important determinations of our lives, when we were born, when we die, who our parents are, who we love, our mother tongue, the weather, all of these remain outside our determination. And so we do well to be mindful of sovereignty's limits. Yet these limits do not mean that other determinants are similarly outside our attempts to steer them. We can and already do make decisions about who gets what, who has what is rewarded, what is punished, what is amplified, what is thwarted. Okay, so I'm moving to 4, the communism is the common in the commons. You know, in recent years, a variety of voices have converged in an embrace of the centrality of the ideas of the common and the commons. And they've thought of these ideas of the common and the commons as central to the reinvigoration of communism. As Silvia Federici and others have pointed out, this convergence is not unique to communists. A spectrum extending from the anarchist left to a capitalist center has made the question of the commons a central one, in part as a response to damages resulting from neoliberal privatization, and in part because of concerns regarding the climate, concerns over climate change. Communists' embrace of the commons echoes and extends Marx's analysis of the enclosure of the commons in capital. The analysis thus has both a critical and a positive component. As Marx explains in his discussion of primitive accumulation, capitalism didn't get going because some worked harder than others, right? That's one of capitalism's own founding myth stories. On the contrary, capitalism got going because some were robbed of their means of production and the protections they formerly had under the old feudal arrangements. Freed of their land and free to sell themselves into, let me say this again. So people were robbed of their means of production and the protections they had had under feudalism. Silvia Federici, if you haven't read Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, it's phenomenal. You should read it. It's a gendered account of primitive accumulation that's also really wonderful at showing what sorts of things peasants and serfs had under feudalism that were in fact expropriated from them with the rise of capitalism. So these people were hurled into the labor market as free, unprotected, and rightless proletarians. Right? They were freed of their land and free to sell themselves into capitalist exploitation. The history of their expropriation, Marx tells us, is written in the annals of mankind, in the letters of blood and fire. The contemporary critical focus on the commons highlights the continuity of the forceful expropriation of what belongs to all in common by and for the few. David Harvey, for example, emphasizes capital's ongoing accumulation by dispossession. Private property is inseparable from force, as is clear not only in foreclosures, gated communities, the use of police to protect banks and bankers, but also in the wide array of legal forces brought to bear to collect the debts of ordinary people, even as corporate debts are ignored, forgiven, or displaced back onto the people. Because of the interconnection between property and violence, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri emphasize an additional critical dimension of the common. It designates an area between and overlapping the different spheres that liberal thought tries to call public or private, state or market. For Hart and Negri, what is common can't be confined to either, but instead discloses the arbitrariness of the division. Right? How is it that reproduction, which is common to all of us, is private? Deployed critically, the notion of the commons makes visible ongoing acts of violent expropriation across the globe. Expropriation of water, air, space, health, resources, knowledge, and basic capacities of social reproduction. So this has been the critical side, what the concepts of the common and the commons let critical theorists accomplish. At the same time, the common and the commons point toward new practices and institutions of egalitarian cooperation. This positive direction, sometimes designated with the active verb commoning, can also be found in Marx. For example, in the German ideology, Marx describes communism as turning existing conditions into conditions of unity. When the community of revolutionary proletarians takes their conditions of existence, and those of all of society, under their control, they transform what was abandoned to chance into conditions that they determine. Now this, of course, isn't easy. It can't be accomplished simply at the level of ideas, but has to be carried out in practice. Capitalism perpetually divides people, engendering hostility and competition among them, even as their interconnected work produces conditions common within classes. Uniting together, building solidarities, is thus vital not just for overturning capitalism, which may well destroy itself, but for creating a free, more just, and egalitarian future. So a number of contemporary positive approaches to the common and commons describe different experiments in commoning, from urban gardening to Wikipedia, small-scale solidarity economies, to the global movements in the squares that we've seen over the last year or two. While these examples point to very real problems of scale, which become extremely urgent when we think about climate change, they nonetheless indicate a vital trajectory for the left, one focused on the practical organizational work of creating a different world, one that manifests a collective desire for collectivity. If communism means anything at all, it means collective action, determination, and will. Under conditions of capitalism's cult of individualism, to emphasize acts of individual decision and will reduces communism to one among any number of possible choices. Such an emphasis assents to capitalist form, rendering communism as just another content, an object of individual desire, rather than the desire of a collective subject. Desire remains individual, nothing happens to its basic structure. Lukács's insight into individualism as a barrier to collective will formation illuminates the collectivity of communist desire. Lukács notes that the freedom of those of us brought up under capitalism is the freedom of the individual isolated by the fact of property, a freedom over and against other isolated individuals. He explains that the conscious desire for the realm of freedom can only mean consciously taking the steps that will really lead to it, and in the awareness that in contemporary bourgeois society, individual freedom can only be corrupt and corrupting, because it is a case of unilateral privilege based on the unfreedom of others, this desire must entail the renunciation of individual freedom. Communist desire is a desire for collectivity. In a setting of capitalism's distractions and compulsions, one may very well feel like something is wrong, something is missing, something is deeply unfair. One might try to make a difference, signing petitions, making signs, blogging, voting, doing one's own part as an individual. And this is the problem. One continues to think and act individualistically. Under capitalist conditions, communist desire entails the renunciation of individual freedom, the deliberate and practical subordination of self in and to a collective communist will. This subordination requires discipline, work, and organization, which we've all been seduced into resenting. It's a process carried out over time and through collective struggle. Indeed, it is an active collective struggle that changes and reshapes desire from its individual form into a common collective one. Now, I follow Lacan in understanding that desire always involves a gap, a lack, or a rupture. Desire to persist as desire has to remain unsatisfied. The gap necessary for communist desire is manifest in the rupture of communism with its setting. And we know this from Marxist themes of negation and the communist legacy of revolution. But of course, it's the case that communism is not the only political ideology that mobilizes revolution and negation. There have been, obviously, liberal, democratic, bourgeois revolutions. And communism shares with capitalism a revolutionary mobilization of negation, right? That's why communism can be the negation of the negation. The difference, then, is in the way they subjectify this gap. Capitalist subjectification, the desire that it structures and incites is individual. Communist desire can only be collective, a common relation to a common condition of division. So collectivity is the form of communist desire in two senses. Our desire and our desire for us. The collective desire for collective desiring. Now you might think, wait a minute, isn't the object of communist desire a world without exploitation? A world characterized by equality, justice, freedom, and the absence of oppression? A world where production is common, distribution is based on need, and decisions realize the general will? Once you start describing this perfect world, though, we're always going to find some problem with it. It will always come up lacking. Something is always missing. What about an end to sexism and racism and egoism? What about an end to social hierarchies? What about religious freedom and the intolerant? And then you can keep going along this line all the way to, well, like, what about meanness and bullying? It's no surprise that communism's critics criticize communism as utopian and impossible. It seems to be another word for perfect. But the impossible of communist desire is not the same as its cause. The object cause of communist desire is the people, and again, the people not as a name for a social whole, but as a name for the exploited producing majority. For any government, system, organization, or movement, the people remain elusive, incompatible with, and disruptive of that which attempts to reduce, constrain, or represent it. Authoritarianism, oligarchy, aristocracy, representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, none of these forms really worries very much about the disconnect between government and the people. But the disconnect, the gap, matters for communism because communism is not only an association for governance, it's also an organization of production. The people are elusive. They exceed their symbolic instantiation as well as the images and fantasies that try to fill the gap. Communist desire, a collective desire to desire communism, occupies and mobilizes this gap, recognizing in its openness, right, recognizing this kind of impossibility of the people, and treating this as the movement of communism itself. We are the 99%. Okay, so I'm going to conclude, you might say, with a kind of Leninist theme on the actuality of revolution. Yeah. To some people think of the Leninist Party as like a specter of horror, a remnant or trace of the failed revolution, the terrors of which must be avoided at all costs. In such a vision, which may not be concretely held by anyone, but I think many kind of vaguely intuit this, communism is not reduced simply to the actual, which is always necessarily ruptured, incomplete, and pregnant with the unrealized potentials of the past, but it's actually reduced in this kind of version of Leninism that I just described. It's actually reduced to a parody of one actuality, an actuality that, as I mentioned from the start, changed over time and from different perspectives. In such a reduction, which is an ongoing process, actuality is displaced by an impossible figure, a figure so resolute as actually to be incapable of revolutionary change. Rigid, exclusive, dogmatic, it's hard to see how such a party could even function in a revolutionary situation, much less ever attract members in the first place. How would it get people to show up, to march, to write and distribute newspapers, to put their lives on the line? How would it grow or spread? In contrast to the kind of scary specter of the Leninist Party, Lukács's account suggests an organization formed as the subjectification of two lacks: the chaos of revolution and the non-knowledge of the party. Lukács argues that Lenin's party presupposes the actuality of revolution. It's a political organization premised on the fact of revolution, on the fact that the terrain of politics is open and changing, and that revolutions happen. Revolutions are not messianic events wherein long-awaited deities intervene in human affairs. They're results, conditions, and effects of politics wherein states are overthrown, dismantled, distributed, reconfigured, redirected. In the chaos of revolution, tendencies in one direction can suddenly move in a completely opposite direction. Because the revolutionary situation is characterized by unpredictability and upheaval, no iron laws of history provide a map or playbook that revolutionaries can follow to certain victory. The actuality of revolution requires discipline and preparation. Not because the Communist Party can accurately predict everything that will occur, it cannot. And not because it has an infallible theory, it does not. Its theory, like the conditions in which it is set, is open to rigorous criticism, testing, and revision. Discipline and preparation enable the party to adapt to circumstances rather than be completely molded or determined by them. The party has to be consistent and flexible because revolution is chaotic. The actuality of revolution is thus a condition of constitutive non-knowledge for which the party can prepare. It's a condition that demands response if the party is to be accountable to the exploited and oppressed people. A communist party is necessary because neither capitalist dynamics nor mass spontaneity imminently produce a proletarian revolution that ends the exploitation and oppression of the people. A revolutionary period brings together and confuses multiple and changing groups and classes. Different spontaneous tendencies, different degrees of class consciousness, different ideological persuasions converge. The Leninist Party doesn't know what the people want. It's a form for dealing with the split in the people, our non-knowledge of what we as a collectivity desire. As Lukács writes, if events had to be delayed until the proletariat entered the decisive struggles, united and clear in its aims, there would never be a revolutionary situation. What the party knows is that such a lack of knowledge must not impede action because it cannot forestall the actuality of revolution. The party then is an organization situated at the overlap of two lacks, the openness of history as well as its own non-knowledge. Collectivity, common cause, and common determination is difficult. It involves giving up what we don't have for what we can't achieve. We are and cannot name a whole. We are and cannot fully justify the coercive and productive forces we unleash. The Communist Party is a form for maintaining this gap without yielding to fantasy or fatalism, which is why Badiou theorizes its operation in terms of courage as well as confidence. And because I know there's some Badiou heads, I mean Badiou of theory of the subject, not the later Badiou who's like said no party. So Badiou in the earlier work recognizes that, or theorizes the party in terms of these ideas, courage and confidence, because the party has to be situated in this place of a gap. Neither instantiation nor representative of the people. The party formalizes its collective desire for collectivity. When the party fails to keep open the gap of desire, it ceases to be a communist party. The actuality of revolution is the press or pressure that we feel that we can't put off but must redirect. The communist horizon is what we must focus on and use as a guide if this redirection is to be compelled by the force of the common rather than by the speculation of the few.